All right, so here we are, end of the semester. Did we make it? Barely. All right, so the point of the study session is to first go over the expectations for the exam, and then the questions were available starting at midnight last night or this morning, I guess. And so we'll go over the questions on and kind of give you some hints on what to focus on for as you're filling it out. Okay. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. Let me bring up Canvas. Here it is. All right. And so the expectations for the final exam are really very similar to the expectations for the midterm exam. But there's maybe just one difference. So the exam, you have a lot of time to work on it, right? You got it today, and you have until the end of the day, Monday, to work on it. So there's ample time to work on the exam. And my last study session that I just got out of, students were wondering if it's okay if, as they start working on the exam, to reach out to me if you have questions on any of the specific questions for the exam, and that's totally fine, right? So, I mean, Alana, I don't know if you've gotten a chance to look at the questions, but probably a lot of students haven't. And as they start working on them, they might be like, oh, wait a second, I'm not sure I understand this. So I just wanted to let everybody know that, I'll be around, email, text, and I'll be able to get back to you with questions while you're working on the exam. And so it's due Monday, December 19th at 11:59 p.m. If you are going to be late, just, reach out to me. That's, I know it says I only accept them in extraordinary circumstances, but if you are running late, reach out to me, and then, I can determine whether or not you can turn it in. And usually I'm pretty cool about it. Now, the difference between the midterm and the final is that I've noticed that students oftentimes don't read comments on the final exam, right? And that's totally cool. I know a lot of students are just like, I got the grade, I'm ready to move on. So for the final exam, if you want me to make comments, I'm more than happy to make comments, but make sure you make a notation as you're submitting your exam. You can either put it on the top of your exam, like, yes, please make comments, or you can just put it in the submission comment box on Canvas and say, please make comments, and I'd be more than happy to do that. I just don't want to make comments for people who aren't going to read the comments, and that's totally cool. So just make sure you do that. And as always, make sure that when you open the exam and before you start working on it, save it to your desktop, save it to your hard drive, save it to a zip drive. I just had a student this semester who submitted their midterm exam, and it was a blank document. And then when they went back to resubmit it, they had lost all their work. And so I don't want anyone to be in that circumstance, because that's a horrible circumstance to be in. So that's the same as the midterm. And, there are 6 questions on this exam. You choose 4 of them. Okay. And so that's the same as well. It's 4 questions that you'll be answering. I want you to submit it as a full document. Don't submit it question by questions, because that's extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, for me to grade on Canvas. And this exam is worth more than the midterm. Okay. The thinking is that as students sort of figure out how to take the class and learn from the midterm, oh, I'm supposed to do this, I should develop my answers, then they can apply that to what they've learned for the final. Okay. And that's why the final exam is worth more. It doesn't cover more material. It covers the material from, I guess it's topic 8 forward. Maybe I think it's topic 7 through topic 12. So it's the same amount of material, but it's just, I want to give people who improve, opportunity to demonstrate that they've learned how to take exams and that they're more comfortable with material. Okay, so what am I looking for in terms of best exams? Answer the prompts in the question, right? I mean, that I designate X number of points to the different prompts as I'm grading. And when students don't answer one of the prompts, they just lose points. So as you're working on your exam and your answer, just go back and say, okay, double check, do a checklist. Did I answer all the prompts? That way you can make sure that you're setting yourself up to get the best grade possible. As was the same with the midterm, that pull upon all of the course materials. The cool thing about the midterm, the final exam, is you can really use any materials throughout the course of the semester to help you answer these questions. Now, that being said, I mean, if you only reference the material from the first half of the course, that's not going to be good, right? I mean, obviously, you're going to want to pull upon the information for the presidency and the Supreme Court, et cetera. That being said, though, if there's something we read earlier in the semester that helps you answer like one of the critical thinking prompts, or allows you to like think about elections in relationship to democracy, have that. Bring in whatever you want. Don't bring in external resources, right? I'm kind of getting kind of hardcore on this, because I've had students who are just like not using any of the course materials and just using external resources, and that's not acceptable. That being said, let's say you found a cool like website that allows you to support a point that you're making that's related to course content. That's fine. Just like reach out to me and say, hey, Professor Hankinson, is it okay if I just make reference to this website in relationship to, the efficacy of, proportional voting or something like that? Totally fine. Okay. But just reach out and I'll just say, yeah, sounds good. Proofread, make sure your exam is easy to follow. If you're quoting things directly, you need to make sure they're in direct quotations, because if you don't, it's plagiarism. And anytime that you're using direct quotes or referencing the ideas of others, just make sure you do a citation. And I've got some sample citations there, like We the People, page 345, or topic 9, lecture 1. If you're directly quoting, put it in quotation marks, and that includes the lectures too. I mean, I know that there are transcripts of the lectures, and that, sure, if you want to like use direct quotes, go for it. I'm sure there's other things that you go for, but if you do that, make sure you use quotations. And I know this is an online class, so like collaborating may not be something that students do. However, I do know that students know each other in the real world, the so-called real world, really the fake world. This is the real world, baby. And so, but you can collaborate with others, but the work obviously needs to be your own work. Okay. So Alana, do you have any questions about the expectations for the exam?
Not really. I think I'm good.
Okay, cool. All right. So I'm going to stop the share. And now I'm going to start the share again. Now we'll take a look at the questions, okay? And go through the questions. There we go. Let's see if that happens. That is not what I wanted to happen. All right. Here's the final exam. Are you seeing my screen?
I'm seeing the screen, not seeing the exam questions.
Okay.
Might be kind of paused, or
yeah,
paused,
I think that's
frozen.
what it sort of said. How about now?
Yes, now.
All right, cool. All right. And so there are 6 questions. The first one has to do with the presidency. Okay. And so there's 2 main tasks that I'm asking you to do in this one. The first task, and I'm just going to color code just because it's going to make life easier. The first task is I want you to, there's lots of different powers that the president has. Expressed, implied, inherent, delegated powers. Okay. The first thing I want you to do is just describe the difference between those 4 categories of power. Okay. Now, as I tell students that you do not need to tell me everything you know about expressed, implied, inherent, delegated. I'm expecting you to summarize, okay? And maybe give one example to like elucidate your and to better demonstrate your competency. But you don't need to tell me every expressed power, okay? Like, because there are many. So the first task is explain the difference between those categories of power that the president has. The next, and I'm just going to go ahead and highlight it, is the next task is to focus on the expressed powers. Okay. So thinking only of the expressed powers, I want you to say, which 2 powers do you think are most essential to a successful presidency? In other words, if you were the president and you could choose only 2 express powers to do your job, which would you choose and why? Okay. There's no right answer to that, right? Well, there could be a wrong answer to that, right? I mean, I think there are some powers that are of equal importance. Okay. So as long as you're picking a power that's really important to the presidency, an express power, and as long as you pick an express power, if you don't pick an express power, that would be wrong, right? Just make a strong case for it. And then on the flip side, identify and describe one express power that you could do without that's less essential to your job. And I'll just give you a hint. You could pick the pardon power if you want, right? But you might want to go for something else, okay? It's going to benefit. I mean, people aren't going to lose points if they say the pardon power. It's just one of the easy, it's kind of low hanging fruit. You know what I mean? Like, so maybe say of the expressed, maybe pardon power to the side, is there another express power that would be like, maybe another branch of government could do it, right? And that it's not essential to the job of the presidency, okay? But don't freak out if you select pardon, right? Sometimes it's good to sort of challenge students to sort of say, go for something a little bit more difficult. And explain your choices, and the best answers will briefly describe the specific express powers that were selected, right? So if you say the commander-in-chief power, that is, you can't be a president without that. And then you explain why. Just tell me a little bit about what the powers of being commander-in-chief entail. Okay, don't have to tell me everything, summarize, but do just like demonstrate that you understand what that means. All right, so what do you think? Any questions on that question?
I'm all good.
Okay, good. Yes, the next one. My overly excited lecture on judicial review. No, I'm just kidding. So I also teach civil liberties, unfortunately, not this spring, but it's one of my favorite classes. So where we talk a lot about judicial review. So explain the concept of judicial review as it relates to the Supreme Court. And then, so a broad definition of it, and then identify the Supreme Court case that establishes judicial review and briefly describe the facts of the case and the decision. And I'm going to highlight that briefly. Okay. Marbury, oops, I don't want to say that. A case that starts with M, hopefully everybody knows what it is. It's a complicated case, right? So I'm not expecting you to tell me everything you know about that case. Okay. But, just a brief description and why the decision, like how it relates to judicial review. And then, so that's sort of the first part of the exam, or the question. Tell me about judicial review. The second part is like judicial review in action. Okay. So the textbook provides several categories of judicial review in action. Explain the way the Supreme Court exercises judicial review at the federal and state level, providing specific examples. Okay. So highlight that. Okay. And so there's judicial review is exercised at the federal level and at the state level. Okay. So give examples of both of them. Okay. And then the third thing, and this is sort of the critical thinking prompt, and I'll put that in pink. It's about the implication that judicial review has for democratic governance. Okay. I'm going to take it out of pink because it's kind of too bright. But I mean, there's a good case to be made that on the one hand, judicial review is beneficial, but it's also detrimental. And I want you to sort of talk about and why we need it for democracy and why judicial review can kind of like be dangerous for a democracy. Okay. And then on the whole, do you think that judicial review is more beneficial or detrimental to democratic governance? Okay. There's no right or wrong answer to that last critical thinking prompt. Okay. And then it says that the best answers will reference both topic 8, lecture 2, and the We the People textbook. Okay. Because I don't think you can answer that without using both of those resources. What do you think about that question? Do you have any questions about that question?
I do not have any questions, but I would like to say I too got overly excited about going over the Supreme Courts.
I know, right?
My
Right. It's fascinating. The Supreme Court is fascinating. And I mean, it's a source of great joy for me, but it's also a source of great frustration too. So I was sort of thinking about over the winter break reading maybe sort of there's an autobiography, or not an autobiography, there's a biography of John Marshall, the first Supreme Court justice. And I thought I might read that, or just maybe like a historical overview to sort of like ground me a little bit more and get me out of like sort of the contemporary like realm. But yeah, definitely. All right. Question 3. So first, in your own words, define the difference between political values and ideology. Okay. And then explain the similarities and differences between political values and political ideologies, and explain the relationship between those two concepts. Okay. I know that I have sort of 3 prompts there, but I mean, it kind of feeds into each other, right? Because I mean, I don't want to give anything away, but as you start writing about political values and political ideologies, it will like easily morph into explaining what their relationship is. Okay. And how they're similar and how they're different. Okay. So that's the first piece. The second piece is talking about the main characteristics of the dominant ideologies in the United States: liberalism and conservatism. What are the main differences between liberalism? Or next, describe the main characteristics and values that define the 2 dominant ideologies in the United States: liberalism and conservatism. You don't need to tell me everything you know about liberalism and conservatism, right? Just like the main, for somebody who knows nothing about liberalism and nothing about conservatism, what would you tell them, right? So they could get a good grasp of it. And then talk about how they're different. What are the main differences between liberalism and conservatism? And then I want you to evaluate, because since we're so polarized, I really want to give people an opportunity, whether they're liberals or conservatives, to think critically about those 2 ideologies. So what aspects of conservatism do you most agree with? Which aspects do you least agree with? What aspects of liberalism do you most agree with? And which aspects do you least agree with? Okay. And make sure to develop your evaluation and provide specific examples as needed. Okay. And so just something to keep in mind with that, I'm not asking you to say which is better, right? I don't care which ideology students think is better, right? I mean, they're ideologies, right? They're viewpoints, but I want you to think about them in terms of like what's the positive aspect that we get from conservatism? Like how do we grow as peoples, or even as a democracy, by the conservative tradition? Same with the liberal tradition, right? And then vice versa. I mean, if you pick one, fine, but that's not really what I'm looking for. I just really want you to kind of critically evaluate it. So what do you think about any questions about that question?
Kind of, obviously, as we know, our political system kind of split down between, Republicans and Democrats. Sorry, I'm doing a poor job of formulating this. But do you kind of mostly, when talking about the difference between like conservatism and liberalism, like comparing and contrasting that, are we like talking more specifically like between those 2 parties, or like overall broader spectrum?
Yeah, no, like conservatism and liberalism are ideologies.
Mm-hmm.
That you can be more conservative and be a member of the Democratic Party. You can be more liberal in certain ways. Like if you are like I mean, if you could be like a conservative, a social conservative, or you could be an economic conservative, but you could be a social liberal, and you might end up in the Democratic Party, right? Because because of your social liberalism. Likewise, you might be a social liberal, but you might be more of a economic liberal, right? Like where you don't want interference in the marketplace, or right? I mean, like an economic libertarian, right? You don't want
Mm-hmm.
government involved in our lives. You don't want it involved in our social life, but you also don't want it involved in our marketplace. And you might say, I could fit with the liberals because they don't want, government involved in your social life, but I really don't want government to be involved in my economic life, right? So ideology doesn't always match up directly with parties. And I mean, today you might say there are many Democrats who really aren't liberals. They might be more like democratic socialists, like AOC or Bernie Sanders, right? I guess Bernie Sanders technically is not a member of the Democratic Party, but he caucuses with them. On the flip side of that, you know, you sort of look at the ideology associated with those who support President Trump. And you might say a lot of old school conservatives are looking at that and saying they're Republicans, but they're not conservatives, right? They're different than that. So, right, the long and the short of it is ideology is separate from parties. And so this is asking you to talk about ideologies. Now, your textbook does say most liberals are in the Democratic Party, most conservatives are in the Republican Party, but that's not necessary for answering this question.
All right.
And you can, the best answers, I don't think it says there, but the best answers will pull upon both the broad lecture I gave on liberalism, conservatism, and, you know, that we used for the David Brooks discussion, but also the more specific stuff like liberals support X and conservatives support, you know, these policy issues, right? So you can pull on that too. Good question. Question 4 is about freedom of the press. So in 1787, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "The basis of our government being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." Okay. Now I'm just going to leave that quote there because I don't want to talk about the quote. I want students to sort of figure the quote out. Is that okay with you? Okay. But right, I mean, you know, I guess as students are working through that, if they are like, hey, I'm moving in this direction, am I going in the right direction? That's fine, reach out to me. But part of this exam is to look at that quote and like try to figure out what it means. Okay. And so I want you to explain the message Jefferson is trying to communicate in this quote. Why does Jefferson consider government without newspapers such a problem? Which is a little bit of a hint of interpreting that quote. And how does this sentiment relate to the role that the news media plays in a democracy, as discussed in topic 10, lecture 1? Okay. So, and then the critical thinking piece here. If Jefferson were to return to 21st century America, I guess I should put the word century there, 21st America. I mean, I'll make that change and add it to the question. Do you think he would still make this statement? Why or why not? Okay. So what do you think about that question? Doable?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I went over all the questions earlier this morning. It was one of the first things I did. So I've been thinking about it for a little bit, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, I've offered this question up before in past semesters, and students, I think, sometimes are hesitant to grapple with it. But I want to encourage students to take the risks, you know, because, hey, take one of the hard questions. It's kind of, you know, I mean, you should go with questions you feel most comfortable answering, but I think you can learn from taking some risks as well. All right, number 5, explain the concept of voter turnout and describe trends in voter turnout over time in the United States. Pretty straightforward. Describe some of the factors that influence rates of voter turnout. Why do voting rates in the United States lag significantly behind those in most other developed countries? And what reforms might be pursued in the United States to increase voter turnout in elections? The textbook talks about several reforms, as does the lecture. Do you think reforms should, and so this is all real descriptive, right? I mean, this first part, this is, you know, very descriptive. I mean, there's a right or wrong answer to that. But this question about whether or not reforms should be implemented in the United States, you know, that's a matter of opinion, right? You know, should we have, well, I'm not going to say the reforms, but you know, you can make a case that we shouldn't make it easier for people to vote, right? That there should be barriers to voting because then only the most informed voters are going to show up, right? But there's a really good case for the other as well. So there's no right or wrong answer to that critical thinking question. This is a pretty straightforward question. It's really pretty descriptive, except for, you know, you got some critical thinking there. Do you have any questions about that question?
This is, you kind of already answered this, but when talking about you know, the various reforms that, you know, you could potentially implement, are we allowed to talk a little more like, I don't want to say abstract, but kind of like, you know, you could make the argument perhaps that like creating a multi-party system may encourage people to vote more because it might think that, okay, well, if I have more options and people who more align with me ideologically speaking, you know, okay, then maybe more people might, you know, turn out.
Yeah, that would be that you could do that. Make sure that you pull upon those articles that we read about like the benefits and the drawbacks of a multi-party system. And if the cases that they're making are that it would improve voter turnout or engagement, then you could definitely use that, right? So, uh, uh, I guess I would say that when if a student just gave me that, I'd be like, they don't know, you know, there are other reforms you might want to reference as well, because you want to demonstrate that you have some knowledge of the more straightforward, you know, having, you know, voting on weekends or day of registration and stuff like that. But yeah, as long as you do at least one of those kinds of reforms, it's more traditional, doing something like multi-party system, and you know, and the next question having to do with like proportional vote and ranked choice voting, and you could bring that in there as well, right? So yeah, that's totally fine. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay, cool. And then the sixth one is just again pretty straightforward, but in terms of description. But I think that the last prompt is, you know, gives you a chance to really think more deeply about that. So there are different criteria for winning an election. One criteria is that you have to win with the majority vote. One is that the winner gets the plurality of the vote, and then the winners are determined by proportional vote. So explain each of these criteria, describing the strengths and weaknesses of each of these criteria. Okay. And so there are right answers to those questions, you know, but that the strengths and weaknesses are up for debate, right? So there's no right or wrong in saying this is a strength or this is a weakness. I mean, some might see one aspect of proportional vote as a strength and others might see it as a weakness, but the definitions of those are set, right? And then of the three, which do you think is the best criteria for winning an election to a national legislative body like US Congress? And I just wanted to highlight that because sometimes students, they get confused and they just like start talking about voting in general, like elections in general, like electing the president. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking like if for electing Congress, like we just did, should we use majority vote, plurality vote, or proportional vote? Okay. And then explain your answer. So that's just a little hint there. Make sure that you're talking about electing a national legislative body. And the only one that we have is US Congress. So we'll go with that. All right. That's the questions. Do you have any question about that last question?
Nope.
All right. I think the next time I teach this class, I need to add more direct stuff about ranked choice voting because all students were really excited about ranked choice voting. And as I was like, you know, prepping the class this term, you know, I just didn't, it should have crossed my mind, but in the future, I'm going to add some more stuff on that. But I think we've got enough to, you know, sort of deal with as it is.
For sure.
All right, so that's it. So Alana, do you have any questions or anything, any concerns?
I think I'm pretty set.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. And thanks for all your hard work this semester. And then for those, I'll make a recording of this and then for those who were unable to attend. So I'll just conclude with saying good luck for your finals. And also don't hesitate to reach out. I'll be around for answering questions throughout the course of the while you're working on your exam. Okay.
All right. Sounds good.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for hosting.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.